What's up, Call of Duty fans? It is the time for CDL Seattle. Could not be happier to see the CDL back in action. I'm sure you guys are feeling the same, but maybe you want a little bit more of a look as far as each of the groups and some of the predictions and things to kind of keep an eye out for as we're jumping into our first day of games. As a reminder, first day of games, as usual on Friday night, are just the opening 4 matches. On Saturday, it'll go through all of the elimination and qualifier matches, 6 in total, and then Sunday will be dedicated just to the 3 playoff games. So let's take a look at our pools and let's take a look at our teams and see how exactly we're expecting things to kind of pan out this upcoming weekend. Starting off in Group A. This is an interesting group because if you guys have been watching any of our videos here on Checkmate Gaming in the last couple of days, I've been talking heavily about this is a must-win group for all 4 teams. All of them are sitting in the middle of the standings, and maybe it's actually better for us to take a look at our standings first before we actually look at this pool. Take a look at where everybody stands currently. Atlanta FaZe up top at 170, Dallas at 150. Both of those teams are off this upcoming weekend. Then you've got Chicago at 130. Could definitely make some moves this weekend, but are in a tough pool as Minnesota is in their pool with them at 110. Florida at 100 for our top 5. And then it's pretty much anybody's game from 6 even down to 12. Paris at 60, both London and Optic at 50 points. Toronto, Seattle, New York all tied at 40 points. And then 20 points for the Los Angeles Guerrillas. Now keep that in mind as we take a look back at what Group A looks like. Got London and Los Angeles first. That's 50 points versus 20 points. And then Seattle and New York, both those teams tied at 40 points. So these are all teams underneath the top 5 that could potentially find their way into at least close to the top 5 standings, depending on how this weekend goes. If they can win their 2 games to get out of pool, things are looking better for them, even more if they can find a way to get through at least one, if not both, of the playoff teams they have to play up against to potentially win the event in whole. But I want to start talking about London and LAG first. These 2 teams are very interesting to take a look at. LAG, this feels like it's the last chance for this roster. I can't say that for sure. I have no idea if there's any consideration for moves, but if there isn't, if they don't win if they don't win a set this upcoming weekend, it's time for some moves, I think. This was a squad that had no identity in the beginning of the year. They make a lot of changes, and they still seem like they do not have a full-on identity. The interesting point about this series is both teams are relatively even when it comes to the search and destroy, but the London Royal Ravens have a slight edge when we look at the respawn. The other thing to keep in mind for London is the fact that Shawnee still likely going to be playing, but will Zero be officially starting for Jerd this upcoming weekend? Every single post seems to lean towards, yes, he is going to be starting in the immediate future, which is interesting because I talked about it in my Roster Mania video yesterday. If you didn't check that out, we talked about Gunless potentially going to LA after this weekend is over. Definitely go back and check it out. But for London, who's going to play up with Dylan? Because Zero is not a fast player. So that's where my biggest worry is and why I think an upset is very potentially possible here for the side of LAG. London, played well during Florida. They had a Game 5 versus Optic. They played a relatively close series, kind of, sort of, versus Atlanta FaZe with the exception of the hard point. And then the second time they played Optic, again, it was an 0-3 loss, but it was a close game, and kind of a close game in both the respawns. With no Jerd, and now Zero in the mix, will those respawns get better? I don't necessarily know if I can sit there and say yes. You go back to what LAG was able to do during their time at Chicago. Again, this team in respawn has been awful, but in their most recent weekend, they played a lot better. They went 2 for 3 in their hard points with one of their losses. Actually, 2 of their losses were at a combined around 25 total points. It was a very narrow score, 248-250 versus Seattle and 223 versus 250 versus Seattle as well. The one downside to LAG was that their search and destroy, which is, again, like I mentioned, one of their strong suits, did not look particularly good last week, dropping both of them to Seattle, but beating Optic Gaming. Their domination has been a major headache. So you take a look at this series specifically and you're wondering, who do I have winning it? I think the upset is possible, but based on the fact that LAG has not looked good in their search and destroy, they're getting a little bit better in the hard point. And then the other side, London's been playing relatively well through their search and destroy, but have not necessarily played at the same gusto that we expected for their respawn. I still give a narrow advantage to London in the domination. Even though this team went 0-3 in their domination in the Florida home series, I still think this team will do better than LAG. I can't say that for sure. If London does win this game, it'll be in 5. If LAG win in this game, I think it could be in 5 as well, if not potentially 4, depending on how the picks kind of move out for both of those teams. So, an interesting first match, to be sure. Taking a look at our second matchup, it'll be Seattle versus New York. And again, Enable will be back in the roster for Pander this week for Seattle, a team that just came off going 3-1 in Search and Destroy, and they only dropped 3 maps in Hardpoint. They went 4-3 there, about a 50-50 split. The thing about the last time we saw these guys in Chicago, which was underwhelming, was their domination. They only went 1-3. That's been the biggest pinnacle of success for Seattle throughout this year. And candidly, they got smoked by Los Angeles Guerrillas, and they got beat up pretty bad by the Atlanta FaZe. So, in another matchup here versus the New York Subliners, a team they have not played up against before, do you think they'll do well? To get a full spectrum of the answer, we'd take a look at New York first as far as what they were able to do since Mac has been in the mix. Their Search and Destroy and their Hardpoint has been very good. Their domination has been a little bit all over the place. The first weekend in Chicago, not so great. The second, most recent weekend, much better. A 154-156 loss, a 141-166 loss. The other 2 were wins. New York has gotten better as a cumulative squad by a lot in the last handful of weeks. Can Seattle, with Enable back in the mix, do enough work to take the Dom, a Search, and a Hardpoint off this New York Subliner squad? I don't think so. I've got New York taking this one 3-1. I will give a little bit of wiggle room there for Seattle to take one of their map picks, whether it is a Hardpoint or it is a Search and Destroy, but I don't have them getting through this New York team in domination, which is not good because that's where Seattle had been the strongest. And you talk about, well, why sub out Pander for Enable when there was improvements being made? And I think it's another one of those cases with LAG where there is no identity with this team initially, with the exception of Octane just being incredible. The rest of the team kind of had to find themselves. What roles did they fill? Where did they find themselves finding the most success throughout a map, whether it is in Search or in one of the respawns? And that was essentially helped along by Pander being in the mix. Now that Apathy, Karma, Slacked are all playing at a more highly consistent level, with Octane, who's been incredible all year, can Enable fit into this team better? I think that's what they're trying to find out, and honestly, I don't like their chances in this first matchup versus New York. So let's jump over to Group B. Paris will play up against Chicago. Minnesota will play up against Optic Gaming LA. Let's start things off with Paris, who had a very underwhelming weekend last weekend, dropping both of their opening matches, only winning a single map. But that map win was a domination versus the Atlanta FaZe, and during their 0-3 loss to Optic Gaming, they played a very competitive 3 maps, 231-250, 5-6 round 11, and then a 133-174 dom. Again, Optic has been looking good in the domination. So, will there be enough for this Paris team to get past Chicago, who's going with Prestinni in the mix now for the first time? Don't feel very good about it. I think we saw a more revealing and more exposed Paris over the last few weekends since we went online. They didn't look particularly great when they played at Dallas. They only found a map 5 win versus the Seattle Surge. And yeah, you could argue they played a lot of good teams. They played Chicago, Minnesota, Atlanta, Optic Gaming, 4 of which played very strong in those weekends. And they technically played them relatively close. My biggest thing about this Paris team where I think they have an edge is in the Search and Destroy. I don't feel particularly great about this squad in the domination. As you take a look at their record, they're just an 8th rating overall, 7-7, 50-50 down the road, kind of the same thing with their Search, but it's at the differential that they play these Search and Destroys. If they can clutch up, find the ice in Search, and find a way to keep themselves calm and collected in domination, it is possible they beat Chicago. But coming into this next weekend, you got to think, look at the new roster. Prestinni in the mix means that Chicago's going to be super strong up front with their SMGs. That has been a point of question mark, I think, for Paris through and through. Kismet sometimes has great games, sometimes has bad games. Kind of the same thing for Jacques and Zed. Rarely do we see all 3 of those guys firing on all cylinders all the time. One of the reasons why they haven't gotten past a major competitor yet. They haven't beat Atlanta, Chicago, have not played Florida yet, but they also have dropped 3 series versus the Minnesota Rockers. So that's where I give a lot of favor to Chicago. They can come out and essentially run at Paris and get away with it more than they maybe would a different opponent. My only question mark for Chicago is their Search and Destroy. It's been a little bit all over the place over the last couple of weekends, a couple of great maps followed up by a couple of atrocious ones. But beyond that, they've been essentially 50-50 in both the respawns. They still average 2nd across the board in each of these, which is still pretty astounding. But that is subject to change if they do not continue to keep a forward momentum track moving with things like their search and destroy. They need to find a way to kind of recorrect themselves, I guess is my long-winded way of saying that. So then we take a look at our final matchup, Minnesota versus Optic Gaming LA. This should be an interesting one as neither team played each other at Florida, to a little bit of surprise after Minnesota. They were able to get over to Florida Mutineers in a tight 3-0. Then they dropped their match versus both Toronto and New York. The Toronto one definitely more surprising than the New York one, I think, as they kind of got beat up a little bit in the hard point, and they dropped the domination. For Minnesota, if you want to get past Optic Gaming LA, you have to be good in the respawn. You have to be good at hardpoint. You have to be good at domination. Because for Optic Gaming LA, yes, they've been playing well at search, but they have been picking up the most steam in the respawn. And I think that this is one of those squads that if you can stop them from getting momentum in the first hardpoint and in the domination, your chances of closing out in 4 or getting to a map 5 and extending the series to maybe a map that you pick that you're feeling good about, I think Minnesota should have a narrow edge here. On top of that, who knows? Maybe Optic Gaming is going through some chemistry issues. Maybe that's why the potential of Gunless going to the squad has been talked about and why it's being kind of pushed around the community a touch. But you got to give credit where credit is due. Chino played incredible. Dashy played very, very well. Slasher played incredible. Even Kenny played very, very well. And TJ played pretty consistently throughout the weekend as well when they played at Florida. But you look at the quality of opponents they played up against. 2 matches versus London. Okay, they played well. Sure, given some credit. 3-0 versus Paris. It was a tight one. Paris, not a bad team. But then they also had to go Gant 5 versus Toronto, who, again, surprised us. And they played Atlanta phase close. Maybe you could argue that Optic Gaming LA did not have the hardest road ever. They didn't have to play Minnesota or Florida. They just had to play Atlanta when they were there. So is there some consideration there? I think they're going to be a little bit hard-pressed to make a solid argument for it, but I think it's definitely worth mentioning as we take a look at it. You want my answer? I think Minnesota takes this one 3-1. I think Minnesota is going to go back to the lab, figure some things out, correct some of those big mistakes that they were making, and some of those close series that they lost. I don't think those turn into close series that they lose, more like close series that they either win or they just flat out period win. So that's where I kind of have things for the first day. Let me know what you guys think down below. Of course, hope you guys enjoy the games and come back to get our full recap after the games are done, not just for day 1, but also for day 2 and of course day number 3. Subscribe if you want to get notifications on when the videos do go live by ringing the notification bell. And if you like the video, make sure you go down there, like the video, and leave us a comment while you're at it. Hopefully we'll catch you guys back for the next one. Until then, hope you keep holding it down. So long.